Hi, I'm Simon. Welcome to the studio. Today I'm going to teach you some basic watercolor techniques that you should know, every artist should have in their repertoire. And they are, we've got a wet in dry, we've got dry on dry, we've got wet in wet, and we've got wet on wet. So subtle distinction there, but an important one. So grab your brushes and let's get into it. Okay, so you can see that I've drawn out 4 squares here, labelled them up so we know what we're doing, and we're going to start with wet on dry. So this is, as it sounds, it's probably the most intuitive kind of painting that you'll do. You pick up a brush, you put paint on it. So I'm just going to grab some ultramarine blue here, put it on paint. You don't want too much water, and I can test a little bit on there. Perfect. So this is wet on dry. I've got a wet brush, a fair bit of water on it, and perfectly dry paper. And I can just create a wet on wet. So that's probably a little dry. That's almost going wet on dry, which is the next one that we'll do, or dry on dry. So this is wet on dry. Using a wet brush, filling in all the gaps. Okay, so the water or the paint will cover the entire surface. Where you start getting little gaps like this, that becomes wet on dry. So this is the easy one. This is how you paint when you're a kid. You pick up a paintbrush, you put some paint on it, and you put it onto dry paper. Easiest one to learn, wet on dry. The next one I'm going to do is dry on dry. So here you have to concentrate a little bit on the amount of water. I mean, that's the important bit really, is the amount of water. And you can see that I'm dabbing this off, drying my brush. You want a pretty dry brush. And then a little bit of paint. And you can see here that dry brush, and I'm just going to drag that across the page. So I'm going to try and use what they call the belly of the brush, and just drag it across the page. And what that will do is skip various pieces and leave you lovely kind of highlights. So depending on how dry your brush is, this is the kind of technique, this is the kind of effect that you'll get dry brushing. And I could add slightly more water. You can vary this amount, still get a dry brush technique, but a little bit more water. Let's put a little bit more in there to show you. There's a bit more water, but still getting that lovely patchy textured effect that you get with dry brushing. Okay, so the reason we use dry brushing, I suppose, is one, to create these lovely highlights. It allows colour to show through it. So if you had another colour laid underneath there, you'd get that showing through. And it's a lovely way of creating texture in a painting. So, and it's generally, it's using the side of your brush, dragging it across the paper, with a really dry consistency on your brush. Don't want lots of water, otherwise we're going to be wet on dry. The next one I'm going to do is wet on wet. Okay, so there's a distinction here that I want you to learn between the first one and the second one. This is wet on wet, and this is wet in wet. So wet on wet, going to grab some clean water, or what was clean, try and get it. And then it's putting water down. So it's having an area, wetting your paper. And you can work this in a couple of different ways. Something that I often do when I'm working wet in wet is leave some areas where I haven't touched. So you can start almost with a slightly dry brushing technique. So you're leaving little gaps, and you can use those for highlights later in your painting. Okay, so just grab some paint, and I'm not sure how well you can see that, but there's, I've wet that, I've left some patches, and then it's just dropping in pigment. And you just see what these lovely soft bleeds that you get. I can increase the amount of pigment. Drop in. The reason I suppose it's soft, it has this lovely soft effect because this wet paint is going into the wet paper and it's just bleeding out and creating these lovely kind of textures and fans. Yeah. The wetter your paper is, the more it's going to do that, and the wetter the paint on your brush is, the more it's going to do that. So I could, restrict the amount of paint on my brush, or restrict the amount of water on my brush, make a really intense kind of mix, and then just apply it in a small place. We're going to get a darker colour. If I took off a whole lot of the water and then just started dropping it in, you'll see it will spread out less, so travel less distance. And the same applies, so if you've got lots of water on the page, it's going to spread out lots. If it's just slightly damp, it's only going to spread out a little bit. You can see this was obviously very wet, this paper, so it's spread out lots. Where it's starting to dry on the edges here, if I just dropped in little colours, little touches there, you can see you can get a much more precise line just on a slightly damp area of paper. And you see these areas of highlights that I've left. They are another way of just creating lovely texture in a painting. And if you're doing you're painting your water all over your picture, you can leave those little areas, then fill in the paint, and those highlights will just remain there, nice and crisp. So that is wet on wet. That's applying paint onto clean water, wet on wet. The final one I'm going to do is wet in wet. So the distinction here is that I'm going to put colour down first, wet, and then apply colour on top of that. So you've got a layer of wet colour, and then you're putting colour on top of that. And that's referred to as wet in wet. This is wet on wet, and it is applying paint to clean water. So that's the distinction there. So I'm going to grab some bit of lemon yellow, lots of water, and just put in a lovely kind of wet mix here. You don't want too much water. You don't want puddles of water. So you could just spread it out until you've got a nice damp kind of just swatch of colour. You see, I just spread it out. Just get rid of the kind of big puddles of water. You can dry off your brush a bit, get rid of the paint. Okay, and then it's grabbing, so rinse the brush out, grabbing a little bit of this blue. And this is going to mix the colours on the page. So we're going to put in this blue here and just watch how it mixes into that lovely green. The shapes you can do, because it's wet in wet, it's going to bleed out and just create these lovely textures and patterns. You could also, flick a bit of paint in here. So just lovely little textures and effect. It's going to bleed out. And it's a nice way of blending colours on the page. So you can actually mix colours on the page. If you wanted this to kind of get a bit of green, might put a little bit more yellow in there. You can get quite a nice variation of colours like this. Okay, so you're never going to be able to control this technique 100%. You'll get better as you practice it more, but it's about allowing the paint to do its thing, to spread out, create these patterns, and mixing colour on the page. That's it for this basic set of techniques. Just 4 techniques that you can master really quickly. I use them in my paintings all the time. I will go into other techniques on the channel, so look out for other videos there, very similar to this one, and I hope I see you there.